Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at this idea of participatory exclusion, which is basically how marginalized groups end up being excluded from decision-making, even when you have systems that are designed to be inclusive. And we'll be focusing on Kenya, and specifically looking at Gloria and Kenyatta's 2024 article, Who is Being Left Behind? Participatory Exclusion of Marginalized Groups in Kenya.
Oh, yeah. Kenyatta's research is fascinating. She really makes a strong case that you can have progressive laws like Kenya's 2010 constitution, but there's still this disconnect between what's on paper and what's actually happening.
So the 2010 Constitution's been praised for its inclusivity, but what did Kenyatta find wasn't working?
Well, the Constitution talks about all the right things. The right to participate, affirmative action, devolution of power to local governments. It all sounds good in theory. But then Kenyatta actually went out and did fieldwork in Nairobi City and Lamu counties and found that marginalized groups, particularly women, youth, and people with disabilities, are having a totally different experience.
So we have this progressive constitution, but it's not actually leading to meaningful change for everybody. What are some of the barriers that Kenyatta identified?
She talks about three major barriers. The first one is just a lack of information. A lot of people in marginalized communities just don't know about their rights or how to participate. It's like trying to join a game when you don't even know the rules you know.
Right. You're not going to be very effective. But couldn't they solve that with public announcements and information campaigns?
Well, you would think so, but what Kenyatta found was that even when they do try to share information, it's often done in a way that excludes the very people they're trying to reach.
How so?
Well, for one thing, public notices are often given with very little notice. Sometimes it's just like a day or two before an event is supposed to happen.
Oh, wow.
And then they announce them through channels that people can't access, like if someone doesn't have the internet or if they have limited literacy.
Wow, that's incredible. It almost seems deliberate.
And it gets even worse. Kenyatta found that a lot of important documents, like policy proposals, are only available online. So if you don't have reliable internet access, which is a big issue for a lot of women, youth, and people with disabilities in these areas, then you're automatically excluded.
So we have this information barrier. What's the second challenge?
The second barrier is about getting to the participation sites,
Ah.
the physical locations. These forums are often held in places that are just really difficult for a lot of people to reach.
Especially in a county like Lamu.
Yeah.
It's way more spread out than Nairobi.
Exactly. So in Nairobi, Kenyatta found that these forums were often held at sub-county offices, which could be quite a distance from where people actually live.
I see.
And then in Lamu, where things are even more spread out, these meetings happen at the ward level. So you can imagine having to travel for hours,
Yeah.
maybe without reliable transportation, just to attend a meeting. And that's a huge barrier for anyone, but especially for someone with a disability or someone with limited income.
Yeah, it's like you can participate, but only if you can overcome all these obstacles first. Not very inclusive. Did she find that even the venues themselves were a problem?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of the venues just didn't have basic accessibility features like wheelchair ramps or accessible restrooms.
Wow.
So even if someone with a disability managed to get to the meeting, they might not even be able to participate.
So they go through all this trouble to travel there, and they're still excluded. It's surprising that they wouldn't consider something so basic.
Yeah, and it really highlights a point that Kenyatta makes throughout her article, which is that even these seemingly small barriers can have a huge impact on whether people feel included or not.
Okay, so we've talked about information barriers, we've talked about physical barriers. What's the third challenge that Kenyatta highlights?
So this one is a bit more complex. It's the impact of societal norms.
This is where it gets really interesting,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not just about logistics. It's about ingrained attitudes that are much harder to change.
Exactly. And Kenyatta found that these norms can be incredibly powerful in shaping who participates and how they participate.
Did she see this playing out in any particular way? Were there any specific examples from her research that stood out to you?
Yeah, definitely. So, for example, she found that women are often disproportionately affected by societal norms. In a lot of these communities, there are very strong expectations about women's roles and about their place in public spaces.
So even if they're physically at the meetings, they might not feel comfortable speaking up.
Exactly. They're silenced by these unspoken rules. Kenyatta even quotes one woman in Lamu who describes this feeling as, "You are there, but you are not there."
Wow, that's so powerful. It's like being physically present, but feeling completely invisible, like no one can hear you. And it's not just women who face these challenges, right?
Right. Societal norms also have a big impact on people with disabilities. Kenyatta found that they often encounter stigma. and they're seen as needing help, rather than being seen as people with valuable contributions to make.
So you have these like intersecting layers of exclusion. You have the information barriers, you have the physical barriers, and then you have these deeply embedded societal norms. It's a lot to untangle. But Kenyatta's work isn't just about highlighting the problems, it's also about finding solutions, right?
Absolutely. She offers a number of recommendations for how to bridge the gap between policy and practice. One key area she focuses on is strengthening civic education.
Okay, that makes sense. We talked about how that lack of information is such a huge barrier. But what does effective civic education actually look like in this context? It's more than just handing out pamphlets, right?
Right. It's about going beyond these superficial awareness campaigns and creating programs that are tailored to the needs of different groups. So, for example, you might have programs that focus on digital literacy for older women, or programs that teach people with disabilities how to navigate bureaucratic systems.
So it's about meeting people where they are and giving them the tools and knowledge they need.
Exactly. And she also emphasizes the importance of making information accessible in practical terms, so providing materials in local languages, using visual aids, holding information sessions in accessible locations at convenient times.
So it's not just about the content of the information, it's about how it's delivered and who it reaches. Did she have other concrete recommendations?
Yeah, beyond education, Kenyatta talks about the need to make participation more physically accessible. So this means things like making sure that venues have ramps and accessible restrooms. And it also means thinking about the location of meetings, especially in rural areas where transportation can be a challenge.
So things like providing transportation assistance or even holding mobile meetings that travel to different communities.
Exactly. It's about thinking creatively and proactively.
This all seems like common sense, and yet it seems like these things are often overlooked. Why do you think that is? Is it just a matter of funding, or is there something more going on?
Yeah, Kenyatta touches on that in her article. And it seems like it's often a combination of factors. Funding is definitely an issue, especially in under-resourced communities. But there's also sometimes just a lack of political will or even resistance to change.
So there might be people in power who actually benefit from keeping these groups excluded.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. And Kenyatta kind of hints at that. You know, sometimes people benefit from the status quo, and they might resist efforts to change things, especially when it comes to empowering groups that have been marginalized.
So these solutions are even more important because it's not just about overcoming logistical hurdles, it's about challenging power dynamics and pushing for systemic change.
Exactly. And Kenyatta also talks about how important it is to empower these communities, to advocate for themselves.
That makes sense, giving them the tools and resources to demand change.
Right. And it's also about shifting those cultural attitudes that we were talking about earlier. Kenyatta talks about the need for awareness campaigns that challenge stereotypes and promote positive representations of marginalized groups. And she also talks about engaging with traditional leaders and influencers to champion these ideas within their communities.
I see. So if you can get the people who already have influence to embrace these ideas of inclusivity, then that can have a ripple effect. Did she suggest any strategies for working with these leaders?
She suggests kind of a multi-pronged approach. So first, it's about education and dialogue, helping these leaders understand the importance of inclusion and the consequences of exclusion. But it's also about demonstrating the benefits of having diverse perspectives and showing how everyone benefits when all voices are heard.
Right. It's not just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do.
Exactly. And Kenyatta suggests providing training for community leaders on how to create more inclusive spaces, how to facilitate dialogue effectively, and how to address discriminatory attitudes.
So giving them the practical skills.
Yeah. And importantly, she emphasizes that none of this can be done effectively without the active involvement of marginalized groups themselves.
Right. The solutions have to be driven by the people they're meant to help.
Exactly. Kenyatta says that marginalized groups need to be involved in every step of the process, from identifying the barriers, to designing the solutions, to evaluating the outcomes.
It's about shifting power, not just giving people a seat at the table, but actually letting them shape the agenda.
Exactly. And that idea of shifting power really came through for me when I was reading Kenyatta's article. It's not about making small changes. It's about fundamentally changing how we think about participation and who gets to make decisions about things that affect their lives.
One thing I really liked about Kenyatta's approach is that she doesn't just give these dry policy recommendations. She really brings the human element to the forefront. She includes all these powerful quotes and anecdotes from her interviews.
Oh, I totally agree. Like, there's this one story she tells about a woman with a disability who went to a community meeting. She was really excited to participate, but the organizers hadn't considered her needs at all. The venue was inaccessible, the materials weren't available in Braille, and she just felt completely ignored, so she left feeling totally defeated, like her voice didn't matter.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It really shows how even small oversights can make people feel excluded.
Yeah. And it shows the need for a more thoughtful and intentional approach to inclusion, one that takes into account everyone's needs.
It's not enough to just say everyone is welcome here. You have to actually create the conditions for everyone to participate.
Exactly. And that requires empathy, awareness, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions about who participates and how they participate.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem, we've explored some potential solutions. What does all of this mean for our listeners? Why should they care about what's happening in Kenya?
Well, this is where Kenyatta's work becomes really relevant. Because these dynamics that she's describing, these barriers to participation, the power imbalances, the struggle for inclusion, these are universal challenges.
So even though her research is focused on Kenya, the insights are relevant to anyone who cares about social justice
Right.
and creating a more equitable world.
Exactly. Whether you're thinking about your own community, your workplace, or even online spaces, these principles of participatory exclusion apply.
So it's about being more aware of who's being excluded, whose voices aren't being heard, and thinking about what we can do to change that.
Absolutely. And I think Kenyatta's work gives us a framework for doing that.
Yeah, I agree. Her research is a call to action, not just for policymakers, but for all of us.
Exactly. And it reminds us that creating a more inclusive world requires constant effort and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, it really makes you think
Yeah,
about the spaces we're in and who's not there.
exactly.
So it's not just about Kenya. These dynamics of exclusion, they can happen anywhere.
Right. And I think one of the things that Kenyatta's work really highlights is that we need to move beyond just talking about inclusion and start actually doing something about it.
Totally. It's not enough to just say we're inclusive.
Yeah.
We have to actually create inclusive spaces.
Exactly. And she asks this really thought-provoking question at the end of her article. She says, if social inclusion is an intentional act, what steps can governments, organizations, and even individuals take to actually bridge this gap between policy and practice?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Because it really puts the responsibility on us to actually do something. So let's say I'm listening to this
Yeah.
and I'm like, okay, I want to make a difference. Where do I even start?
Well, I think the first step is to just look around. Look at your own community, your workplace, your online spaces, and ask yourself who's missing, whose voices aren't being heard.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because these dynamics can play out anywhere, not just in formal settings.
Right. And once you've identified those areas where exclusion is happening, then you can start to think about what you can do to change it. It might be something small, like making sure you amplify the voices of people who are often interrupted or ignored in meetings. Or it might be something bigger, like advocating for policy changes within your organization.
So it's about being more mindful.
Exactly.
Were there any other takeaways from Kenyatta's work that you thought were especially helpful?
Yeah, one thing that really stood out to me was the importance of actually listening to marginalized communities and learning from their experiences. They're the experts on the barriers they face, and they often have the best ideas for solutions.
That makes sense. We need to approach this with humility and a willingness to learn.
Exactly. And we need to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. What works in one context might not work in another.
This has been such a great conversation. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this issue. But Kenyatta's work gives us a lot to think about. So for anyone who wants to learn more, we highly recommend checking out her full article, Who is Being Left Behind? Participatory Exclusion of Marginalized Groups in Kenya. It was published in 2024 in the Sexuality and Gender Studies Journal.
Yeah, it's a great read.
We'll be sure to include a link in the show notes. And in the meantime, we encourage everyone listening to think about what they can do to make the spaces they're in more inclusive. Whose voices need to be amplified? How can we challenge these dynamics of exclusion? These are questions we should all be asking ourselves.
Right. It's a call to action for all of us.
Exactly. So as always, we want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Of course.
Based on what we talked about today with Kenyatta's research, what is one thing you would want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
That's a tough one. There's so much to unpack. But I think if I had to choose just one thing, it would be to really challenge yourself to think critically about the spaces you're in, and how those spaces might be excluding certain groups.
Yeah, that's so important.
Because we often don't even realize, the subtle ways that exclusion can happen.
It's like those unconscious biases we all have.
Exactly. So just being more aware of those biases and how they might be affecting the way we interact with others. I think that's a really good starting point.
And then once you're aware of it, you can start to take steps to address it.
Right. Whether it's speaking up more in meetings or advocating for policy changes, or even just changing the way you talk to people.
These things all make a difference.
Yeah, even small changes can have a ripple effect.
So don't underestimate the power of your own actions.
Definitely not.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Thanks so much for joining us for another deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And be sure to check out Kenyatta's article if you want to learn more. We'll include a link in the show notes. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.